Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Michaela Gabriel, and I'm here to present on behalf of myself, Dr. Suzanne Stewart, and Mr. Steve Teakins, the Executive Director of Native Men's Residence from Toronto, on our collective research regarding traditional pathways throughout urban centers for Indigenous people, more specifically how community, culture, and elder supports can help Indigenous homelessness and life transitions. It's a wonderful pleasure to be here for this conference, but of course, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional territories on which this land or on which this research has been conducted, and that would be the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, as well as the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. Dr. Stewart herself is from the Yellowknife Dene First Nation. Steve is from he is Ojibwe of the Nipissing First Nation, and I'm Mi'kmaq of what is now called Newfoundland. To learn more about the land you're on, I found about this super cool program where you can actually text the city and province that you're in to 1-907-312-5085. And that's just on the screen here, just in case you wanted a quick reference while you're hopefully either traveling for additional conferences in the future, or just need to have a quick reference to support other people in relearning their sense of connection to the land around them and the traditional caretakers of the land that we live on now. I'd also like to take a moment to thank and express great gratitude to the Indigenous education and research initiatives that is part of this project and has been part of this project and are currently ongoing. So the Ontario Network Environments for Indigenous Health Research, the Waakamis Bryce Institute for Indigenous Health, as well as U of T's new Indigenous Research Network. Okay, so we have a lot of ground to cover today, and I'm going to be moving kind of fast because my first recording of this was way over time, so we're going to speed through some things. But I think it's important to lay some groundwork when we talk about Indigenous homelessness and Indigenous transitions out of homelessness. It's important to, of course, contextualize this appropriately, both in terms of understanding homelessness and mental health, as well as appreciating Indigenous peoples ourselves and themselves. Then we're going to take a look at this research project, understanding what goes into community driven practices and research and how that can be done in a safe way. And then we'll look at results and next steps. Okay, so in previous years and in times I've been connected to this fantastic conference, I know there's so much representation and understanding of Indigenous peoples, but I think it's important just from a sheerly statistical point of view to just very briefly review some of the initial stats that we have around the Indigenous population in Canada, or what is now known as Canada and historically Turtle Island. The Indigenous population that's captured in census data, I typically appreciate as a very low estimation of true numbers in Canada due to a variety of colonial factors that have either made it unsafe to identify, or there have been significant colonial impacts to individuals' knowledge of self-identity and self-identification in census. What we do know, however, is according to census data, we have about 5% of the population of Canada that identifies as being Indigenous, which includes First Nations, both status and non-status, Métis and Inuit people. This number will continue to grow over time for reasons we'll see in the next couple slides. But it's important to appreciate that this, Indigenous being an umbrella term for these specific cultural groups, are tremendously rich, diverse cultural peoples with diverse languages, experiences, histories, practices, all of which have come from very careful relationship with the land over thousands and thousands of years. So why it's important to also appreciate some census data is appreciating too that even though at first glance, at first blush, 5% of the population may not seem like too much. Actually, Indigenous people are a very young population. Half of that population is under the age of 25, which typically leads to ongoing growth rate, which we've actually seen in a 10-year period from 2006 to 2016. Indigenous people have 4 times the growth rate of non-Indigenous populations. So they're a young population, they're a growing population, and despite many myths and stereotypes, they're an increasingly urban population, as we'll continue to note throughout this presentation. At least half, if not more, live off of reserve. And that, again, has continued to increase in a 10-year period. So there's a lot of movement from smaller communities into bigger communities as well. And I'd like to stipulate that these facts, these figures really help challenge maybe some people's beliefs and ideas that Indigenous issues, Indigenous history isn't necessary for their work or isn't necessary for their life in Canada. But actually it is. Indigenous people, the youth of Indigenous peoples will continue to shape Canada's future. And we need to make sure that that future is a safe one. So when we think about, again, social context and understanding Indigenous issues, what many non-Indigenous Canadians and the general kind of population get to experience is best captured, I think, in these two numbers here. So the United Nations Development Index identified that Canada has a ranking of 8, which is very high, especially when considering Indigenous peoples in Canada, which rank at 32. So even at first blush, we're again seeing vast discrepancies between Indigenous Canadians or Indigenous people and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada. Housing on reserves and housing structures in smaller communities, as well as urban movement to centers, so like moving in search of employment and education, have long been captured by the research of being, and since the 1950s, as being like very significant. And by that, I mean, housing on reserves has been identified since the 1950s, so decades now, of having major structural damaging, including overcrowding, which then results in major health issues, such as higher rates of tuberculosis, among many other issues in smaller communities. As well, this does range according to certain reserves, of course, that, you know, everyone has slightly different variants, but however, some of this range does include 35.5% to 70% of households on reserves have major structural issues. These are gigantic issues, of course, with a wide scope, and these have been known about since the 1950s. So this is not new, but it does help to better contextualize the impact of what we're seeing today. And just like I mentioned before, urban movement has also been well known and well documented, that many Indigenous people, again, since at least the 1950s, if not before, have moved into the cities in search of ongoing education, employment, trying to return back to their cities later with different skills and traits to be able to help the communities. Lots of different reasons that can lead people to come to the city, but there are a mix of factors when they get there. So we've taken a really brief glance at some of the statistics and percentages that are going to contextualize some of our conversation today and the research that's come out of this work. But what's also crucially important is appreciating the impact of Indigenous people's histories in Canada, most specifically the impact of colonization. While I don't have as much of the luxury of time to really in-depth go into this as much as I would usually like to, I think it would be remiss to not mention it, of course. I think the global and the ongoing importance of appreciating the history and the truth of colonization in Canada and the current impacts to Indigenous peoples continues to come to light in terms of, oh my gosh, much of what we'll discover, but also the residential school system, the 60s through the millennium scoops for sterilization. But all of this, I think, is best described under not only the term colonization, which is important, but also as Professor David Newhouse from Trent University describes as the long assault. And I think that portrays a much better, a much more insightful picture of the impact of colonization on its ramifications today. So he describes that most people now understand that something went wrong. Most people understand and see the consequences on Indigenous people, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, of what I call the long assault from 1857 to 1971, the long assault, because it really was an assault. And we see the effects of that on the incomes of Indigenous people, on the health of Indigenous people, on the mental health of Indigenous people. And I think this is very important to contextualize and keep in the framework of our mind as we continue to interpret the research that we are here to learn about today, but also, again, some more of the stats that we initially see that give us a bit of a cursory overview of home and housing for Indigenous populations, especially in urban centers. So I think it's also crucially important to appreciate that when we talk about Indigenous homelessness, it's not quite the same as non-Indigenous or Western-based understandings of homelessness. Indeed, Jesse Thistle described in his fantastic work on understanding and defining homelessness for Indigenous peoples, that it's not simply the absence of structure or habitation. In fact, it's much more complex, much more multi-layered. It also includes individuals, families, and communities isolated from their relationships to land, water, place, Indigenous, family, kin, each other, animals, cultures, languages, and identities. It's much more multifaceted than initial understandings of what homelessness actually means, or maybe has been presented by. And I think that's important to appreciate as well. Indigenous people experiencing these kinds of homelessness cannot culturally, spiritually, emotionally, or physically reconnect with their indigeneity or lost relationships. So I think it's important to appreciate it's not just the absence of structure at all. That is a very, I think, sometimes shallow way of approaching and understanding homelessness, especially when it comes to Indigenous peoples. Kind of building from that framework, research has also identified that Indigenous peoples also experience what's called a spiritual homelessness, just like Jessie Thistle identified. There's also the sense of dislocation and the tremendous impact that has had due to colonization, due to that long assault. And that has expressed itself in many ways, some of which include the loss of sacred spaces, the loss of access to ancestral lands and traditional territories, either through the creation of the reserve system that also had forcible land movements, or construction of Western structures over top of them, to be honest. And this continues to present itself in different ways, including the ongoing assaults and violations of treaties for water and land access and land sovereignty, most especially in favor of commercial profit. And research, again, has continued to identify over the last couple of decades the importance of how these higher rates of homelessness are rooted and connected to intergenerational and colonial trauma, as well as racial discrimination. And it's really crucial to put these things right at the forefront when we talk about these issues, because without it, we are seeing things that lack the most crucial context and the crucial onus of impact when it comes to Indigenous homelessness. It's never on the person. It's so much more in the context of the situations in which they are trying to live and survive. So many Indigenous peoples move to urban centers such as Toronto. This says Toronto, but many urban centers as well are included to access education, employment opportunities, in some ways to get some advanced training, to then maybe return to their home communities and help as needed, depending on what's necessary, as well as to access additional Indigenous services or maybe to advance further housing. Now, I am jumping ahead a little bit, but some of the participants that I interviewed for my dissertation described their experiences of initially coming into urban centers, some of which was one youth participant described, I was feeling so alone before they were able to connect with services. I had no idea, and I was just completely confused and almost giving up on life sometimes. So it was very overwhelming. There was definitely a culture shock. There was a lot that was confusing and isolating and very challenging. And then one of the elders I interviewed as well described that historically, when he was navigating, moving through different cities across Canada, typically on arrival, he would try and connect with other Indigenous peoples to exchange wisdoms, as he says, on how to survive in a city. So where to survive, where is the cheapest place to live, where to make money, where to get money. Those things were all a very important part of navigating urban arrival. However, a lot of the research that we found in the domain of Indigenous homelessness find that there's a lot of competing barriers for Indigenous people specifically that then challenge housing security and secure transitions. Now, these include what I call external support, so like high housing costs, pervasive and systemic racism, a lack of ongoing supports or access to supports, significant employment competition, as well as cultural disconnection, as well as things that are going to vary a little bit based on a more subjective basis. So that can include accumulation of debt based on if they've been to school before, lack of financial support from family members, maybe some have no support, maybe some have a little bit of support, maybe a little bit different, but also relational ruptures. If they've broken up with their partner and they find themselves that was their housing, that can sometimes subject or continue to contribute to housing loss, insecurity, and homelessness itself. So there's a lot of different, very complex myriad of factors that really contribute to transitions to street living. What we do know is that on arrival, typically, there can be a sense of disconnection from traditional identities, going from smaller communities to larger, more diffuse cities. There's not typically a lot of Indigenous representation in cities like Toronto. And that can also impact how do we connect with safe places? How do we connect with Indigenous services? Where are they? Are they even around? We don't know. It's hard to tell sometimes. And that can produce difficulty navigating and belonging when navigating resources. And again, some initial research has found that there are typically transitions when there's navigating housing loss and insecurity, disconnection from supports, not having the services that they need to access employment and safety that can then translate into use and promotion of substances, gang involvement as well, or involvement in the sex trade. And one of the elders I interviewed again for one of these projects described that there's a lot of people out there like that. She says, so, that's pretty scary when someone goes through the process of getting all of their money together to get their education, come to a big city like downtown Toronto from way up north, and then be faced with homelessness when they get there. And she described the importance and the strength and skills that many Indigenous youth have to be able to make that transition, but the inhospitable nature of such gargantuan barriers that come with living in the city as well, that then result in homelessness. So all these factors together paint a very, very difficult picture for Indigenous peoples and their sense of connection to housing loss. As well, some people describe that shelters themselves can be unsafe depending on the shelter, the experience, whether the person is Indigenous navigating a non-Indigenous specific shelter, and then that can then push people into street living and street transitions. And that's what, again, one of the elders described, that they found that some of the clients that they're working with, some of the people that they're trying to connect to, their community members, have found that some of the shelters and roommate houses are very unsafe, and instead street living is a preferable option. And that's an important choice that they've made. And that elders describe as important to respect that choice, to appreciate that sometimes safety looks a little bit different for everyone. And she describes, that's what I see goes on with some of the homeless people in Toronto, the fact that they're not comfortable in cities in any of the shelters that are provided for them, so they would rather stay on the street. When it comes to homelessness itself, it's important to also recognize when we think about mental health, when we think about supporting individuals, homelessness itself has been identified as something that is inherently traumatic. The factors with which that have led people to homelessness and housing loss usually often typically completely involves the erosion of all domains of support in one's life, which is harrowing enough to think of without really reading and spending time with individual narratives. Just the idea of the total collapse of financial employment and social supports is absolutely devastating and destabilizing. And we see this on the reemergence of either existing mental health issues or the newfound or exacerbation of trauma and traumatic stress symptom disorders. It isolates individuals from their networks, it impacts their identity, and again is tremendously destabilizing, of course. It also impacts an individual's sense of agency and identity. It challenges hope for security of ever being able to leave street living, and again can exacerbate previous mental health symptoms and continue to impact overall mental health. Some City of Toronto surveys have identified that about half, if not more, of those homeless people that participated in these surveys described that access to addiction, health, and mental health services would actually be crucial in helping them find housing, but that current services were inadequate. So we're seeing some gaps along the road. So this chart I thought would be helpful. Like I mentioned, some of the initial census data can be helpful at a bit of a glance. Of course, a lot of this isn't included necessarily, but when we think about the total population of Indigenous peoples in Canada being about 5%, we see these typically represented amongst the percentage of Indigenous population of some of the biggest cities in Canada. Of course, this is an exhaustive list, but it's the ones I could find. With the exception of Yellowknife, which has a much higher Indigenous population, many of the cities in Canada have under 5% of the city's counted population as Indigenous. However, these numbers explode when it comes to the percentage of Indigenous people that are visibly homeless. And again, with Yellowknife, we're seeing some really, really high rates. In Toronto, we recognize that, it seems like 15%, but these are also low estimations in terms of people that are able to participate in being counted. In Edmonton, we again see extremely high rates north of 15, 20, and up to 90%. These are gargantuan rates of overestimation. And I think it's important that we appreciate this all across Canada, all across the traditional territories of Turtle Island, because what else happened across all of Canada, all of Turtle Island? Colonization. We absolutely need the crucial context of colonization of the Long Assault to help us understand why we're seeing such pervasive patterns of housing loss, of housing transitions among those visibly homeless and that's visibly homeless, not even those that are insecurely housed among the urban centers with which Indigenous peoples move to in search of housing and supports. So unfortunately, there continues to be ongoing difficulties, of course. All ages of Indigenous peoples are represented among drop-in shelters across Canada. It's not just, youth or young adults, it also includes their children, established adults that find themselves out of work or insecurely housed, as well as our older members of our communities. Indigenous peoples also face additional and multiple health and housing barriers that complicate and negatively impact their trajectory to street living. And this includes everything from accessing services, education, literacy, ongoing discrimination and colonization. It will pop up, always does. Mental health, of course, intergenerational trauma, and economic instability. And at the outset of this project, there wasn't a lot known about Indigenous people's specific experiences of living on the street. Yes, we can look at percentages. Yes, we can look at ongoing data, but how do we really get a good grasp of understanding people's lived realities and how they've been able to survive and how their transitions have helped them, or what was helpful on their transitions? So we do know that when people are seeking services, there's ongoing structural care barriers for Indigenous people specifically. When navigating resources on reserve, they're typically underfunded or lack specialization. Off reserve, care providers are typically culturally inappropriate or don't understand the Indigenous experience. Research has found that on top of this, Western-based clinical services aren't typically used by Indigenous populations, even if they try and have outreach programs to help Indigenous youth, or Indigenous people, unless they're culturally infused. There's a distrust that's there because of the history of colonization and distrust of Western authority figures. Maybe they had negative experiences of racism in service before, or typically they lack representation of understanding perspectives and worldviews of what health even means. Now, then that can translate into many Indigenous people feeling more comfortable navigating those services that have cultural representation and integration into their delivery. And that can be a little bit tricky, I think, sometimes, because that can present different barriers. But we'll look at that in a moment. But this also suggests that it's important for non-Indigenous service providers to not just have cultural competency training, but cultural safety training. That is absolutely crucial to have in-depth education, to understand and have the tools to navigate those unique barriers that Indigenous peoples face, some of which include, non-judgment. And I know that's seems so simple, but it's a tremendously powerful one. The power of actively listening and understanding the unique experiences, the unique community needs of the person in front of you. So like I mentioned before, culturally infused services tend to be sought out by Indigenous cultural people when they're navigating these transitions, in some ways to promote positive identity that they receive there, also to have holistic support, as well as cultural understanding and additional forms of care. A much more holistic form of approach is typically included among service providers. However, if all Indigenous people are navigating a select amount of Indigenous service providers, that's going to create some long wait lists, and that's going to be extra challenging. As well, this is important for, if we're needing some knowledge keepers and elder support, these are invaluable members and pillars of our community. However, if they're underfunded in their role, then that becomes beholden onto them to invest personal costs and effort into their work and to try and meet their community. And that can be additionally challenging for our elders and knowledge keepers. So we have quite a complex picture here, don't we? We have a very unique experience, a very unique myriad of experiences that push Indigenous peoples into various life transitions, either insecure housing, houselessness, homelessness, but also many intersections of health and well-being in urban spaces, all of which contextualize and surrounded by the intergenerational transmission of colonial trauma. There's a lot here. We need to understand and continue to explore the information of these people's lived experiences to better understand how we can best provide safe supports for them. But much research in the past haven't always been done with community consent, have been extractive, exploitative, and done in a way that is interpreting the results outside of the community's context. So how do we really conduct safe research? So there's many answers, but I'll tell you how we did it. So our general research question as part of what we call the homelessness project was, what are the supports and challenges of Indigenous traditional knowledges in addressing the life transition needs, including education, employment, and mental health of urban Indigenous, including First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people of their homeless population? Okay, so one of the most crucial elements for providing safe research for Indigenous peoples, of course, has to be community partnership. For this project, we had a collaborative, community-based and community-driven partnership between Dr. Stewart and Native Men's Residence, which is a Indigenous culturally based service provider and shelter in Toronto, and has been serving the Indigenous community for many, many years. Together through much collaboration, both in terms of clinical support, research support, mutual gatherings and teachings. These questions that then translated into these research projects really emerged. So it was more about the community saying, this is what we're interested in. How can we continue to do this in research? And can we continue to research this? Indigenous or the Native Men's Resident staff were actually involved in the interview and the recruitment of clients. Myself and our team were working collaboratively with the outreach and housing workers, finding people to interviewing them themselves, exploring these different dimensions that goes into these types of efforts. So for example, one of the ways in which the NAMERES team was looking to explore, how effective are some of the methods we're doing in helping our people, was exploring how what they called the Elder Outreach Program, which was bringing traditional knowledge keepers and elders with the outreach team for supporting individuals that were living in either encampments or were at drop-in shelters or drop-in spaces, bringing them right there to them. So instead of trying to connect and bring some of the clients to maybe a traditional practice or somewhere, bringing that safe space, that elder right there to them, right where they are, meeting them with non-judgment and acceptance was absolutely crucial. So some of this work helped to evaluate, was this helpful for them? Was this actually important? And what are the barriers when doing this type of work? And what are the strengths of it? So it's very multifaceted, very collaborative, and very community-based. The study, of course, was conceived and progressed in the spirit of OCAP principles, and also included the hiring and the work of community research assistants to train community members in ongoing how to do this research and get good work experience as well. So this method was a qualitative in-depth analysis study. We wanted to really look at not just understanding the stats. The stats, we know the stats. We need the life experiences. We need to work with people in a good way of what their stories are and how to hold those stories in a safe way. Fundamentally, that has looked like a narrative orientation which honors an oral storytelling tradition of transmitting and sharing knowledge. One person sharing a story with another and collaboratively exploring and understanding what that looks like. This also includes Indigenous elders and knowledge keepers, as well as after, when things had been transcribed and analyzed, what that looked like was returning back to each participant with a story map, so a chronological view of their experience from what they shared over the course of the interview, as well as meta themes and themes. So the biggest takeaway messages that came from that interview, and having a secondary interview where you could sit down with them and discuss, this is what were some of the themes that came up. What do you think? What would you like to edit? What would you like to change? Is this accurate? How would you, and fully and fundamentally reviewing with transparency and all editing by all participants as could be done. Again, this sort of Indigenous research paradigm promotes and supports Indigenous communities to most effectively identifying strength and solutions, as well as, navigate and help to heal and support their healing needs. So the homelessness project itself was a gargantuan project by qualitative measures or qualitative standards. It included 62 individual interviews, and that included men and women who experienced homelessness or street-involved living, either currently or in the past, as well as housing and outreach workers, so the Native Men's Resident staff themselves, as well as knowledge keepers and traditional teachers. My master's research was actually part of the 4 main overarching data sets that you'll see on the next slide. And that looked at how traditional knowledge keepers and elders supported these transitions and supported clients that were living on the street. From that research, I kind of added a little bit of a bridge. So I added this little section to kind of build off of that. So like, okay, so we know that it can be tremendously helpful, spoiler alert, but how do we employ these sorts of things to now navigating to safety? So how can traditional supports and elder connections and medicine use, how can that help with life transition research? So the rest of this presentation and this research will continue to combine all of this information as a whole, again, a bit of a glance, because it's very, very in-depth. So the interview questions primarily were 4 questions that really offered a chance to very open-endedly explore their story or stories of homelessness. And then we describe, we're interested in these particular these experiences. So be it mental health, harm reduction, Métis traditional knowledges, depending on each specific branch of the project, as there were 4 main branches, as you'll see, to help identify the supports, the challenges and barriers. And then we would also like to know what these different areas mean to you. How would you define them? How does it impact you? And then what would you consider what would you like to see in the future? Kind of an open-ended exploration of future service and what they would like to continue with. These were all adapted to each individual branch, which you will see here. So these are 4 overarching data sets from the homelessness project itself. It included the branches of harm reduction, trauma and life transitions, Métis traditional knowledge, and then traditional knowledges and elder supports. These all were completely individual projects that all collaboratively form the basis of the homelessness project. So we were able to explore many branches of the experiences of homelessness, as well as different dimensions of what our community partner was interested in. So if you can kind of just take a bit of a glance through some of these main meta themes for each individual project, and we'll look at them as a whole in a moment, we see a lot of similar threads. We see the importance and the difficulty of racism and stigmatization. We see the challenge that can pose to identity and healing, the importance and prevalence of culturally specific services, elders in care, as well as the importance of the complexity of identity, just to name a few. So again, these are very in-depth, and we're supportive in helping much of our team complete their education, as well as identifying the very specific nuances for each branch of this project to then support the community's interest in these different dimensions as well. Okay, so some of the overarching meta themes, I'm gonna go over them at a glance, a lot to cover, but we also have some really great quotes, I think, from some of the participants that share their stories with us. So such a big one, traditional knowledge and healing. That traditional knowledge is central to healing. It's not just about, the establishment of stability and security. It's about how to heal, and the importance of decolonizing trauma and recognizing the impact of colonization on the dimensions of homelessness at every step, and the impact and blockade that can present in terms of healing itself. One elder participant described the importance of having traditional knowledge as better understood as a source of support integral to our well-being, just as drinking water and security and shelters are. And she described, because smudge to Anishinaabe people is just like drinking water. It's something that we need. And this helps to challenge what our understanding of homeless and housing navigations, to better be able to illustrate and understand what it means to be Indigenous and the unique needs that Indigenous people have when navigating homelessness. Again, when navigating social supports and social services, there was a great need identified across interviews for education and employment-based training, as well as things that are strengths and solutions focused. This was absolutely crucial for many, as well as a sense of harm reduction or just general acceptance for meeting clients where they are. The judgment from service workers when they experienced that, when there was strict protocols around that, was very challenging and can induce a lot of shame, as well as for many Indigenous clients experiencing the failure of the social safety net. A lot of things that weren't in place to prevent them from navigating street living was tremendously challenging. And I think that's best described as, in this worker participant described how, they were navigating trying to access doctors or care workers or service providers, but they have to go through so much red tape. They had to go through so much requirements and stipulations, and that produced a lot of potholes on the road. So not only was there the failure of the social safety net that precipitated housing loss, then there's ongoing uphill battles that continued to kind of blockade their accessibility of treatment and services. Of course, culture, which can never be understated enough, was tremendously promoted by many people as very balanced and very supportive for their transition. However, this was very complicated, as many things tend to be. So for one of the other participants that actually shared their story, he said, "It's my culture that saved me." And culture had a very powerful healing impact. but it also had a lot of complexity to it. Many people felt a sense of cultural identity imbalance, maybe a sense of rejection from culture because of substance use, a lot of individual, external, and internal factors that created a sense of identity friction. And that, of course, resulted in conflict and pain. This is also where we saw the impacts of early life and intergenerational trauma, but also where we saw beautiful growth and strength, the Indigenous strength that we see in terms of reconnecting with culture, but appreciating it's a difficult journey. One participant described, "My culture gives me peace of mind. It gets me back what I'm searching for with all this drinking, socializing with the wrong people, and everybody sees an understanding of what their spirit needs and their nurturing of it. And me doing my sober and going back to what I believe is who I am makes me rich." That's a pretty beautiful, profound statement. Okay. I would be, of course, remiss not to mention the tremendous impact across different service levels and service engagements that presented itself when it came to racism and life transitions. So racism tragically reared its ugly head across housing, medical services, and navigating social workers themselves. And this was discussed by, the people that we interviewed, including Indigenous knowledge keepers and elders. The outreach and housing staff described their experience, and the clients themselves also described it. And these are three separate quotes that talked about, for a housing worker, they were able to find a landlord that would take the chance on a client who was navigating OW or ODSP, but then when they found out they were Indigenous, that was additional barrier. That might have actually caused them to say, sorry, we're closed. We can't actually take that person. So they described it was more difficult for an Indigenous client as opposed to a non-Indigenous client, even if they had all their paperwork ready. In terms of medical services, an outreach worker described how they had to take their client to a doctor or an intake worker, and the worker was extremely judgmental about their substance use. And that actually triggered the client. They were getting a little bit more escalated. So then the outreach worker had to try and help calm them, help ground them, which can be very difficult, of course, for someone that is already experiencing much destabilization in their lives. And then also try and communicate that to the worker themselves that they were navigating as well. And then a client that I interviewed for my dissertation described working with non-Indigenous workers as an extreme challenge because they lacked understanding of what Indigenous people go through. She said, "We get discriminated on a daily basis. I'm not only Native, but I'm a Black woman too. So when do we get a break?" And that there's that sense of how can you send someone who can't understand their point of view? So I like charts. I find it very helpful in illustrating things. This is a chart that I made for my dissertation. So isn't reflective of the totality of the homeless project participants, but was kind of at a bit of a glance of understanding some of the factors that contribute to housing loss. So the decision to move to the urban center is impacted by either positive experiences, so family motivation, trying to help their maybe siblings, or also, avoiding family conflict, looking for independence, and also resource exploitation. So a lot of reserves have seen different changing natures to employment that were traditionally practiced. So like fishing and forestry have really changed a lot of what's available in terms of small communities, and that facilitate the decision to move to the urban center. However, in the housing experience there's of course a myriad of insecure relationships, debt, child costs, urban expenses that are then compounded by high housing costs, eviction experiences, racism from landlords, and also the removal of low-cost housing, which really shrink the housing pool and what's available. Now, then we see that kind of rupturing event, that triggering event, and it could be a relationship rupture that impacts the housing experience itself. It could also be difficulty in financial and debt accumulation, lack of life skills, so having difficulty living on one's own and having the necessary skills, either cooking or financial management, or even a release from the legal system. There's a variety of different factors that can sometimes push people into housing loss, and sometimes altogether can definitely be tremendously impactful overall. Now, in terms of pushing to shelter, again, I told you I like charts. We have the experiences that some people describe in terms of navigating shelters. So some shelters, maybe the Indigenous shelters are tremendous and wonderful, but there's a wait list. So then some people either navigate youth shelters or adult shelters and notice there's a difference in the resources provided. Some people find, shelters really positive if there is an Indigenous presence and they're familiar. Others may have found experiences of violence, theft, or substance abuse that's there, and that can be very dangerous. dangers too. So again, we're seeing factors that can push people out into the streets. So when it comes into street living, there then becomes a myriad of factors that interrelate with each other. And this isn't by no means exhaustive of everyone's experience or the experiences, of course, but just to highlight a few, there can be cultural rejection for, using substances, trying to navigate their experiences or their experiences of mental health. Lack of life skills, again, impacts from landlord refusal or wait lists, trying to navigate street survival strategies in communities. So trying to find a sense of belonging, maybe that ends up being through sex work or through gangs, which can be very difficult to then transition out of for stability, as well as increased severity of mental health symptoms. And as these bidirectional arrows will show you, many of these interrelate with each other. So there's quite a complex network that can contribute to the maintenance of street living overall. So again, more charts. On the right-hand side, I have here different, so these are like kind of a bit of a comparison of the paths of different community members that I interviewed for my dissertation. So they described on arrival to city, they had a bit of a culture shock in terms of the urban adjustment. On the right-hand side, we see the successful and secure transition of someone who was able to connect with Indigenous services early, who got a multifold benefit of housing and educational supports, felt, a lot of secure emotions in terms of feeling secure and taken care of throughout their transition, and was able to navigate things safely on arrival. However, without services, without that sense of connection, we then on the left-hand side see someone who is navigating insecure housing, navigating the broader external barriers of high housing costs and debt accumulation, lacking housing subsidies, which otherwise could have come from service engagement if they had been able to connect or even knew about them. That could have been something, as well as, low benefits from social assistance. And then again, these contribute with not only insecure housing, but also financial insecurity. And then all it takes is one rupturing event, a breakup, a missed bill, a surprise bill that leads to housing loss and street living. So I thought it'd be interesting to kind of portray these things in a multifold path to kind of just add an aerial view, glance and compare. So elders, what are some of the elder perspectives? What are some of our teachings about understanding homelessness and navigating homeless living? So some of the concepts that emerged throughout my dissertation was understanding that the land is our home. So when we talk about homelessness, we're not actually homeless on Turtle Island. We can lack housing, we can lack structure, absolutely. But Turtle Island is our home. Turtle Island is our mother and we're her children. And one of the elders that worked with clients experiencing housing loss was like, you need to put that at the crux of everything. Keep that in mind, because those people are living close to creation. And it's our job to meet with them, to connect with them, to make sure they're getting what they need for them to navigate their journey. If they would like to continue in housing, if they would like to continue living in whatever shelter they have, in their communities where they have, in parks or wherever, that's okay. They're living close to creation. And we traditionally lived close to creation for thousands of years. However, we did have ceremonies and structures that allowed for traditional beneficial movement and ceremonies that connected us in a safe way to the land. So it's important to appreciate that we're not actually homeless on Turtle Island. Again, housing loss, yes, but Turtle Island is our home. This place is our home. And that I thought was a really powerful importance reframing that also supports individuals in their choice to live or to sleep wherever they may need, depending on what is right for them at that point in time. So culture and healing, again, has been a big dimension across many of these projects. And again, I really like charts. So I thought it would be helpful at a bit of a glance to look at the benefit of medicine use and cultural practice. It had multifold benefits, including individual, interpersonal, and community connection. And I won't go through all of them because I think I'm running out of time. But the benefit has been it promotes a sense of grounding and clarity for navigating stressors. It helps to connect other people and also helps a sense of recovery from racial experiences, just to say the least, on top of supporting spiritual and personal connection and a sense of representation and positive identity formation. So when it comes to supporting Indigenous clients, like I mentioned, some of the elders that I worked with throughout some of these projects and through my dissertation noted that there's a lot of transitions through institutions, be it child protective services, the justice system, homelessness, all those things can exist and can likely be pathways that lead and impact one's sense of belonging. So connection to elders, connection to communities are very important for fostering that sense of belonging and support that has been fractured over their experiences navigating different institutions. Key approaches promoted by many Indigenous elders include non-judgment. Like I mentioned before, I mean, it's spelt wrong on this slide, but non-judgment was absolutely crucial for accepting the person with love and kindness where they are at that point in time. And that it needs to be genuine and needs to be hopefully spiritually based. One elder described their sense of success in working with many different communities and clients all across Ontario and probably across Canada, is because she described, we don't insert protocol into ceremony. I couldn't care less if you used last night, as long as your intention of going into that lodge is pure and sincere. That's all that matters. She describes, there's too much imposed protocol on our people as it is from settlers. We shouldn't be doing it ourselves. Key conclusions from this research is that oppression continues to be a gargantuan barrier. We need re-education, we need to address systemic racism and appropriately heal from the experiences of personal racism. Healing is also a multi-level service issue. And in order to really remediate the culture clash between traditional healing and knowledges and harm reduction, it's important to support and include Indigenous peoples and Indigenous practices into these service deliveries. As well, just like I mentioned, adopting and reformulating research and our understanding of research to do so in a safe way can help contribute to healing and strengthen community bonds and relationships. Some key recommendations, of course. Oops, that's my time. I'm just going to speed through the rest of this. Multi-level service education is absolutely necessary and mandatory for Indigenous peoples, especially those at increased level of marginalization. It's very crucial to have culturally based multi-level services that are inclusive and holistic in nature, as well as incorporating an Indigenous worldview into service provision. That's absolutely necessary to provide both Indigenous strengths and Western strengths for services. Thank you very much, everyone. Please contact us as needed. I am charged to send great greetings and care from not only myself, but also, of course, Dr. Suzanne Stewart and Mr. Steve Teakins. Thank you so much. And of course, references. Take very good care, everyone.